Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Syria is in the news big time because something happened this weekend that I think people have been hoping for a decade or 2 decades or more that would happen. And the leader of Syria has been deposed. So we're joined by Zein Almoghraby, who is the Director of International Programs and Growth at the Journalists for Human Rights in Toronto. He was born in Syria, born in Damascus, went to Damascus University, and is obviously very involved in journalism and Journalists for Human Rights, and an expert on Syria joining us tonight. Zein, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Brian, for having me.
My pleasure. So, I think a lot of people aren't terribly familiar with what's going on. Why don't you start with the most recent news, and then we can go back and do some background. So what happened this weekend?
Well, this weekend is officially the end of 54 years of the ruling of Assad family. So it's not the first Assad being president of the country for 24 years now. His father also ran the country for 30 years. So since 1970, they've been in charge of everything, whether it's social, political, or economic, even the military itself. And it's over.
And it happened far quicker than anyone thought.
No one would have thought this was even possible. So whoever would say that I've seen it come in, I figured that out. We may have been optimistic to a certain point, thinking that Assad will see a day. Well, he's going to have to leave office. But for it to happen so quickly, practically within 11 or 12 days, that was unimaginable. It's beyond believable. I was just texting a colleague of mine who is in Turkey. He's been displaced for 12 years now. He's from Aleppo. That I think now I'm starting to process that Assad is gone. It was beyond our wildest dreams for him to leave quickly. And I understand it's been 14 years of a civil war, practically. Some people
14 years of a civil war.
So, yeah, almost we're getting close to it, because in 2011, the whole thing started where Assad unleashed his forces, security forces, the army, bombing cities, destroying villages, displacing 13 million people are displaced internally and in other countries. And Brian, keep in mind, Syrians are not 100 million people. 23 million, 24 million maximum. So 13 million, we're talking about more than half of the population was displaced because of this man. We're talking about estimations that we don't know exactly where it starts or where it begins or where it ends of victims, but the range starts at 400,000 and some people take it up to 800,000, and we still don't know what is the exact number. We're talking about 100,000.
Hold it. 400 to 800,000 of what?
People.
Dead people, murdered people.
Murdered, yes. They were innocent victims. I think it's a small minority of them who were willingly participating in military operations. Most of people were killed in their homes. Most people were trying to escape their cities and villages. Most people were killed in the streets protesting against the government. And most importantly, even the people who were killed from the army when the armed conflict began in 2012, those people, most of them are in mandatory military service. So in Syria, if you are a male, you have to serve in the army for 2 years. Not optional, you have to do it. So a lot of these people who were killed in the army, we don't know if they wanted to be there or they want to participate in anything that Assad was forcing them to do. So we're talking
400 to 800,000 people.
Yes.
Murdered.
Yes.
And I understand that a comparable amount up until this past week were in jail.
Correct. 100,000 people were documented to be, I don't want to say in prison because that's not proper word, because it wasn't legal, even according to the Syrian law. These people were kidnapped by the Assad regime. Around the 100,000 people. Unfortunately, so far, again, we're still at the beginning of the whole situation, so we don't have the numbers yet. But so far, the estimations between 40 to 50,000 people have been freed from political prisons that were liberated in the past 48 hours. Now, there's another 50,000 people. It's creating a situation of it's joyful for people who were freed, but it's not so great for people who are still looking for their friends. I have a friend of mine, I don't know where he is. There's people who are looking for their family members, and we still don't know where there's prisons we don't know about, cells we don't know about. And, Brian, in these circumstances, misinformation spreads so quickly. So there's people talking about prison under a prison, and people are digging in different kind of places of the country, and even media coverage from local Syrian media that were in exile for the past 24 hours. I would say at least 80 to 90% in it was about political prisons, because they were talking about how to find the people who has been liberated. And now there's organizations working on documenting the names and making lists of all of the people that they found in these prisons. So it's an obsession right now for the past 24 hours about this issue, because again, the 50,000 people may have left us, but they may still be somewhere we don't know about. And then this is now the kind of emotional roller coaster that we are going through at the moment.
And you mentioned, 13 million people displaced. I understand 5 or 6 million of them have actually left the country. Is that correct?
Yes, mainly to Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan.
And lots of them living in refugee camps for years on end.
Correct. And in best case scenario, you will have a card for protection, and the protection means that you have identification card. So you cannot travel in some of these countries between a province to the other. You cannot have a lot of the jobs that you should be eligible to have. You do have the education and the skills, the experience, but you're not allowed to have them. So living conditions are not very pleasant. Now, I would say they vary between a country and the other, also based on your status, your social, your economic status as Syrian, but it's not the best situation. So most people are desperate to go back to their homes, to go back to their cities, villages, towns, and going back to their businesses, to run their businesses again, and try to be, as my friend said, normal again.
Normal again. Now, this rebel force, who are they? Where have they come from? And are they better than what was there, or equal or worse?
Well, they consist of different groups, but there is the main group. The main group is HTS. Now, the translation roughly is the Commission for the Liberation of Syria, or the Levant. This group it can be considered to the very, very religious side of things. Now, some people say extremist. Now, what we know about it, for the US, it's considered to be a terrorist organization. However, they're stating that now they are reconsidering that kind of classification of this entity based on their behavior, their statements, and also the fact that they ran a small chunk of the country in the Northwest for the past 7 years almost, and they've managed to do it within reasonable kind of situation. Now, they are not the only ones. There are other armed groups. How dangerous they are, so far what we know is from their actions and their narrative, that their leader, Ahmad al-Shara, his name, what he is saying. So the actions of this group, they went into Aleppo first. Aleppo is a diverse city. It has a reasonable Christian population. It has one of the oldest Christian churches on earth. And they went into the city. They did not get even remotely close to the Christian communities. They did not bother anyone. They provided services, security, and they moved on. So that gave some sort of comfort that they are going to stick to the narrative that they were stating, which is, we are not going to intervene in anyone's religion, in anyone's beliefs. Our job is to get rid of Assad. And they proceeded to do that, going into other places where the Christian majority, in some of the towns they took over, and things went, I would say, smoothly so far. So I'm telling you, from what I know, from what is documented, things were not problematic. Same happened in Homs, which has a very big population, Christian population, and Alawite minority population. Alawites are the sect that Assad belongs to. Also, no problems happened for the past at least 3 days. Nothing happened, and they've made it all the way to Damascus. So what I can tell you, if everyone is careful, everyone is cautious when talking about the groups, but people are looking into the acts and also the statements, in addition to foreign countries' behavior toward this group. So when the US states that they are reconsidering the classification of the organization, when the Turks are collaborating and communicating with the organization. So we have people from different kind of backgrounds, or countries from different kind of backgrounds, willing to coordinate and collaborate, and they're reconsidering things. Everything is a little bit too positive, I would say. So I wouldn't make a judgment or an assessment immediately right now, especially it's been 12 years, 12 days since the operation began, and it's been what, 1 day, maybe 2 days since Assad is no longer with us, or no longer in the country. So we cannot make any kind of reasonable assessment, but things are going well so far, and they do have an incentive. They have a great incentive to behave, and that incentive is, if you want to be in charge, or you want to be a key player in the country's future, you cannot keep your vision or your narrative that you held before. And the leader of this armed group, he does understand that, and he changed his narrative. He had an interview with CNN where he moderated everything he was saying. He spoke to the public in Damascus yesterday, and he made it very moderate statements. He kept it Islamic, but he made it moderate and more tolerant to all kind of groups and political point of views. So that's the bet, that the incentive for them is going to keep them acting this way.
Is this a done deal? Assad supposedly has left the country and is in Moscow, but some of his forces are still on the coast, and have they given up, or is there a chance that things might turn the opposite direction?
Pro-Assad communities and population, so it's not just forces, there is a population that was taking the side of Assad. Understandably, there's way too many reasons in the context of Syria. A lot of people left their cities, so from Homs, from Damascus suburbs, they went back to the coastline where I don't want to use the word where they originally come from, but that is their main kind of provinces. They have 2 provinces there. They went back there, but they did not give up all of their guns. So tanks, all the army-related equipment, they left behind, but individual rifles, handguns, etc., they still have them on them in that region. And my understanding, even in Homs, a lot of them did not leave. They stayed in their homes, they have their guns, and now they're negotiating based on the fact that, is it going to be a rule of law situation? Is there going to be security for everyone, equality for everyone when dealing with authorities that is armed, meaning the police? And based on that, now they are negotiating, even giving up their own individual, like handguns and rifles. The statements that we have so far, we have individual statements from high-ranking military officers going mental on Assad for being a traitor and for letting them suffer for all of these years without giving them anything and making them live in misery. And then we have today the Council of the Alawites, which is the religious council of leadership. We can say the elders of the Alawites community. They made a statement that it was clear Assad is gone, and all they want right now is to have a country that is again inclusive, that is not going to be exclusive to them or other minorities. It's going to be based on equality, and most importantly, that all citizens will have access to justice. So the problem here, Brian, that we are dealing with is a lot of people are going to be asking for accountability in the coming weeks. Yeah. And accountability needs very proper pillars to be carried out correctly. And that's the fear of everyone who was on the side of Assad during the past 14 or 13 years, and also the fear of other people who want to see a proper transitional period rather than vindictive, bloodthirsty revenge.
What do you think the chance of that is?
To have a proper transition?
Yes.
It seemed, I don't want to be very optimistic in a way that doesn't make sense, because I do have a side, and the side is democracy. I do have a side, that side is human rights, and that requires me to be optimistic and believing that things will be okay, and there would be a chance to have a good fight, like to make it a very decent place to live in. So from my perspective, everyone is doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're saying what should be said. They're behaving very responsibly. So something today that showed me that maybe it is possible. We might go through a transitional period without blood, that people will be held accountable in a proper legal way, and we can have communal and social or societal peace. The scenery today was that the leader of the rebels, the armed rebels, with his prime minister, that ran the small piece of the country in the northwest, sitting with the former prime minister in Damascus, talking about how they will hand over some ministries and how they will exchange experience and how they will be able to form a government that would be able to provide proper services to the public. So seeing that 2 weeks ago, if you would have told me that is going to happen, there's no way I would have believed you. It's impossible to believe.
It's just amazing that this happened, and it happened so quickly. And 12 years of a civil war, but it all seemed to have come to a crescendo in 12 days. So it's unbelievable. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with our guest and talk a little bit more. I want to talk, if I could, a little bit about the background and the history and how Syria got to where it is today. And then I want to talk about what happened in the 12 days, what the different factions are, and what we can expect in the future. And I also want to talk about the role of Russia, of Iran, of Hezbollah, etc., and really sort of put this in a perspective so we can have a complete understanding of what's going on in Syria and the wider Middle East. Stay with us, everyone. This is going to be an interesting conversation tonight. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Our topic tonight is Syria. What the heck is going on? Our guest is Zein Almoghraby. He is from Syria. He's from Damascus, born in Damascus, and went and graduated from university in Damascus. Zein, you have a current position with Journalists for Human Rights. What's that position?
I am the Director of International Programs.
And what is Journalists for Human Rights?
Journalists for Human Rights is a Canadian organization. We are based here in Ontario, Toronto, and we work with journalists across the globe to promote and protect human rights, in particular, specifically in countries that are fragile, going through conflict or just got out of conflict, to help all of the actors, whether it's civic actors, to accomplish tangible change and improving living conditions for the population.
And you have a law degree from Damascus University and then a project management certificate at University of Toronto. You've been a legal coordinator with a legal practice in Damascus, a senior project coordinator in Jordan for the Center for Defending Freedom of Journalists, and then several different positions over the course of about 9 years with the Journalists for Human Rights. Tell me, how and when did you leave Syria?
2012, October.
Why?
The actual reason is that I was going to do my exams to be accepted for a master's program, administrative law. And on my way to get there from the southern west suburbs, I was stopped at a checkpoint, out of many checkpoints, but there was a checkpoint where they wanted to shoot me. The problem is, in this case, I survived. But the problem in this case is that I didn't know why. They just looked at my ID, looked at each other, and made the decision that I should not exist anymore. So that is very problematic, because then I'm not going to be able to maneuver. I'm not going to be able to be careful. There's nothing I can do. So if you're going to get executed without knowing why, or there's no reason for it, or a reason that you can process, then it becomes impossible to survive in these conditions. So I had to leave on the 12th of October, 2012.
You came to Canada?
I went to Jordan, Amman, Jordan, and that's I worked there for about 2 years and 10 months. I worked with the Center for Defending Freedom of Journalists, and then I came to Canada on immigration visa.
Excellent. Well, we're glad to have you here, but obviously you're very cognizant of what's going on in Syria and obviously very connected to it. And so we appreciate your expertise. Let's take a step back for a couple of minutes, if we could. Tell us, if you could, where Syria is. Make sure everyone understands where it is, who its neighbors are, and how did this family, what was it, 50 years ago, get control of it?
Yes. So Syria is a country that is located in the Levant region. The Levant region sits on the eastern southern side of the Mediterranean in the Middle East. So Syria is bordered by Turkey from the north, Israel from the south, and Jordan, and from the west, Lebanon, and from the far east, it's Iraq. So it's situated in a place that is usually not very stable. And Syria is a diverse country when it comes to ethnicity. It has two major ethnicities in it, Kurds and Arabs being the majority. And when it comes to religions, also it has um, two major kind of sects when it comes to percentages, but it has many religions, other religions and sects in it. So it has Christians, Muslim Sunnis, Muslim Alawites, Muslim Shia, Muslim Ismailis, and also other kind of sects that practically don't exist in other countries. So that diversity, in addition to the geographic location, always makes it an interesting kind of place. And to add to it, even from a natural kind of scenery, the country has on one side mountains with snows, and on the other side, it has a semi-desert kind of land next to Iraq. It has oil, it has natural gas, not a lot, but it has a decent amount of that, in addition to agricultural output. So that the country also has a diverse sources of income. It does have kind of, you can say, a little bit from everything, not a lot from one thing.
And the capital city, Damascus, I understand, is really quite a modern, prosperous city, or at least it was.
It used to be, so it's not very difficult to get it back to that situation. Similar to Aleppo. Aleppo is a city that is built to be an economic center, a Middle Eastern economic center. So it has practically all of the infrastructure that it needs. All it requires is to have a rule of law and has some operational situation where they can do their business, and it's ready. The infrastructure is there in Aleppo. In Damascus case, it's built to be more of an administrative city. It's also a big business kind of center in the country and in the whole region. It is the oldest inhabited capital on the planet. And Aleppo is one of the oldest inhabited cities on the planet. And that's the interesting part about it. When you go to one of the oldest mosques in Islam that is built in Damascus, the same mosque has in it a part that used to be a church. And then you find Star of David in some of the walls. And then there's the Syrian ancient religion with the god Baal. So also you find some signs. So that mosque will show you all of the development of the Semitic religions in one building. So there is all of that history where you can go to places where the prophets walked through and stuff like that. So it is interesting to visit. It's a great touristic place. I'm not going to do a commercial here, but it is very, very unique kind of place with that uniqueness in geographic location with decent, I would say, resources. And also it was a hub for more than 100 years ago for the development of Arabic ideologies. So whether Arab nationalism or even socialist tendencies or even Islamism, Syria played a major role in developing these ideologies. So people who are activists, whether you are to the right or to the left, you will have some connection to Syria in one way or another. And it's a very interesting situation when you find a communist and an Islamist. When you say Damascus, both of them go, oh, Damascus. So that's kind of, there's that uniqueness to the city.
But given everything that you've described, how did this one family from a minority, sect of take control in a dictatorship?
Yeah, being a fertile land for ideologies, it developed, and one of the ideologies that were developed in Syria was the Ba'athist ideology. It's an ideology that is based on nationalism and some progressive beliefs, but also socialism. So that's an interesting combination that happened with that ideology. It relied heavily on the aspect that there are people who were struggling, especially farmers that are or were living in the Alawites areas, who are Alawites, and also relied on the Arabic aspirations for unity, liberation. Those are the objectives of that ideology. That ideology prospered. That ideology was able to spread among the youth, and those youth were encouraged to join the army. And at one point, they became a majority within the army, or a very, very strong force in the army. At some point in 1963, they organized a coup and took over the whole situation. Now, the party at that point of that ideology, the Ba'ath Socialist Party, it was diverse. Leadership was diverse also. It was led by Christians, Muslims, and Alawites, and other minorities like Druzi, etc. But with time, Whether it was planned or it was not planned, that's subject for discussion. But with time, it became more and more with a majority of one group. So Alawites were becoming more of a majority within the party ranks, and then start to become majority in the leadership. Hence, they start to become majority in the army. Now, that can be so not problematic, but it became problematic in a country that is diverse and yet did not reach a point of citizenship, of understanding we're equal citizen. And we need inclusive governance or something of this nature. And that created some tensions, and it fueled hatred in one way or another, which pushed the Ba'athists to become more and more violent throughout the years. So between 1963 and 65, they executed many army officers who did not align with them ideologically. And again, it wasn't just one group within the Ba'ath party at that point. It was still forming as such. But they start to purge the army from all of the officers who held different kind of beliefs, whether liberal, conservative, traditional conservatism, or even communist, nationalists, anything that did not agree or align with them were purged. Then after 1965, in 1966 in particular, they start to push away people who don't believe or agree with them on everything within the party itself. So the party start to purge itself, kicking out the more conservative elements, and then start to kick out the elements that don't believe in violence much. Then we reach the year of 1970, when the Ba'ath party leadership consisted of very strong men who came from the same sect. And the struggle between them was about ideology, benefits, and social networks of benefits. Who can provide more to people in the army, officers in the army, more benefits to gain and own their loyalty? And Assad was victorious. He prevailed in 1970. In November, he did a coup, took over the country within hours practically. It took 3 days officially, but it was 3 hours operation. He took over everything, the newspapers, the TV, the radio, the army. He had the airport, but he had all of the army positions and all of the army battalions, brigades, etc. And he set up a constitution that fits him very well in 1971 and became official president ever since. Died in the year 2000. And a process of very, very smooth transition happened to hand over the presidency to his son, who was not 40 years old. They had to change the constitution to fit it. And all of the other elements they had to play around to make him a president. And they did manage to do that. So he was a president in the year 2000 at the age of 34.
At 34.
At 34, a doctor who studied in England came back and became a president.
And violence just continued, if not got worse.
They
younger.
Yes, they inflicted violence based on how they considered what they considered as being a threat. The more of a threat you are, the more violence they are going to cause, but also how much they hated the group. So for Islamists were their main target. So most of the time, if you are taken by the government with the accusation that you're an Islamist, again, Islamists can be anything to them. It can be a person who prays. It can be a person who does have political beliefs. It doesn't matter. You will be taken. It's very unlikely in the 80s and the 90s that you will ever see the sun again. So people who were taken in the 70s, they were killed. But in the 80s and the 90s, they saw the sun again in the year 2000 when Assad Jr. came to power, because he wanted to show that he was a progressive, like a very moderate. He was educated in England. So he was this open-minded European-like kind of individual. He was trying to actually put that image on, and he reduced the violence. The violence went down significantly starting the year, even before 2000, but in starting the year 2000, all the way till 2005, where he felt pressured and he was pushed to leave Lebanon. The Syrian army was in Lebanon since 1975. At that point, he switched his attitude. So he started to become violent just like his father, displaying violence in a way that start to not make a lot of sense. That's when you don't understand why you being arrested and why saying this makes them angry and saying that does not make them angry. So that confusion start to kick in, and all it built up and built up till the year 2010. And in 2010, in Tunisia, there was this person who burned himself alive in a protest of the economic situation in Tunisia, and then what is known the Arabic Spring started in the year it practically started in 2010 at the end of it, but it started in 2011, and Syria was not far away from it. There was a famous political prisoner in Syria, that Riyad al-Turk, and he was imprisoned for more than 20 years. And just 2 days before the protests in March broke out in southern Syria, he wrote that Syria will not remain the kingdom of silence, and that we are not an island. And no matter how many walls you build, how many prisons you build, change is going to come to this country. And that's what happened within days. Protests started in southern Daraa because just kids, so between the ages of 10 and 12, they were watching the TV. They were seeing what's happening in Tunisia. They were seeing what's happening in Egypt at that point, the Arab Spring. And they got excited, carried out. And so they wrote on a wall something within the lines that it's your turn now, doctor, because that's how we refer to the president, doctor, right? So they wrote that on the walls, and they were arrested as children, and they were taken by the government. When their families went to take them out, the officer who was in charge of the security of that province, or the governor, he is related to Assad. He told them that you're never going to see your kids again, and if you can't make new kids, send us your women. Now, it's a very conservative community, and it's a very semi-tribal community even, and that's what started the whole events in Syria on March 15th, 2011.
What an unbelievable story! What an unbelievable history! And yet, even after 12 years of civil war, it all sort of came to an end in 12 days.
And everything that was built, because we were referring to Iran and Russia, but Iran in particular, Iran has invested significantly in the country. There is a religious aspect to it, but that religious aspect is associated with ideology, since the Iranian regime is an ideological regime. And so you can see the investment, and it serves the political economic interest of the Iranian government. And they invested in it too much. They invested in many cities, and they bought a lot of property, and all of that's gone. All of the changes they tried to do.
I don't understand, because some people think that this current rebel force is a potential theocracy, more like the theocracy in Iran, than certainly Assad was. So why were they so supportive of Assad?
That's a key question. Even if when people Google these things and they come back to me with being like the sect of Assad, they are like Shia. They're very close to Shia. They're really not. And Wikipedia will tell you they are a subsect from Shia, and you will find it in books, but in practice, otherwise don't like theocracy. They don't like to be told what to dress or how to behave or how to live their life. They like to live their life on their own kind of way, unlike a theocratic regime, which is the Iranian regime is imposing on their own people. So they don't have much in common in that context. They are much closer to the rebel group, actually, when it comes to many set of beliefs.
Yeah.
But however, they disagree on a very critical item in that belief, which is, I don't want to compare it with other religions, but let's just say if a group of people believe a person is a god, and there's another group of people cannot accept a human being a god, that's a critical part. No matter how close we are, how much we have things in common. So between Shia and Sunnis, there is a lot of things in common, and between the Iranian regime, theocratic regime, and the armed group HTS in particular, there is way too much in common, but there is that very critical part where there is not just disagreement, it's a breaking point where it's very strong. So you tell me, what about practicality? When it comes to practical implementation, it's not going to matter so much. That is to be seen, actually. Are the Iranians going to be very flexible, very agile, and they're going to be able to maneuver and present themselves to the rebels in a way that they will push aside the things the rebels don't like to hear about and present themselves as being just as conservative and as religious, and they can be actually partners?
But if they had supported Assad for such a long time, such a long period of time,
It, yeah,
and the role of Hezbollah, I think, has to come to play as well, is it not?
Hezbollah most likely is out of the whole equation at this point. Hezbollah was very
But
involved.
Iran was, please correct me,
Yes,
from what I
please.
understand, is Hezbollah was very involved in Syria, very supportive of Assad, and supported in that regard from Iran.
That's correct. Yeah. And Hezbollah was way more involved than Iran, at least to the faces, right? Or in people's faces. So Hezbollah was involved and accused. I'm not going to say involved. So they were accused in many atrocities, in many violations. What I can tell you is confirmed documented violations, which is displacement. Hezbollah was involved in sieging towns, villages, and parts of cities of populations that they deemed to be anti-government, anti-Syria, or anti-them, their own interest, and they displaced them. The Iranians, when they got involved in that process, they were more into using other proxies, militias from Iraq, militias from Afghanistan, and other places. They didn't seem as much. Now, I'm not telling you they're going to be successful in maneuvering and working with the rebel group, but they might have a chance just because of how similar they are. But with the bloodbath and the blood history, it's going to be an uphill battle for them. I think that the Americans would have a better chance with them based on the
Tell,
history of what happened.
tell us about the role that Russia's played.
Russia played a very interesting role in a very bad way. So the Russians' intervention in Syria started in 2014. They only intervened because Assad was being sieged around Damascus. A rebel group, completely different from the existing one right now, managed to siege a good part of eastern side of Damascus, and was the first time where Assad officers, like the officers in the army, usually they have their own residencies, they have their own kind of neighborhoods or their own towns on smaller cities. So it was the first time a town of officers' families being sieged and being shot out at for 3 years. So after 3 years, it's the first time that happens. Assad freaked out. It was very alarming, and he requested, acquired, and begged for the Russian intervention. And the Russians intervened in Syria immediately with their air force, helped him save the day, kill the rebels group leader, and change the whole course of the civil war, because Assad was losing at that point. And moving forward from 2014, he started to win again, and he was taking over land and more. It was just a matter of time for him to control most of Syria, which he did just 2 weeks ago. He had the biggest chunk of the country, the biggest chunk of the population of the country, the economy. The only thing he was missing is the area that is controlled by the Kurds, and they control the oil and the natural gas. But he had the upper hand with the help of the Russian Air Force, the insane amount of bombing the Russians inflicted. So the Russians are responsible directly for the displacement of the people who were living around Damascus. Damascus suburbs, massive. I can't describe it to you. It's heavily populated. Before the war, it was around 3 million people. All of these people were displaced from around Damascus. Some of these towns, they have Aramaic names for a reason, because they did exist from the times of Jesus. So they're ancient cities that were completely destroyed. There is, in the eastern side of Damascus, one of the oldest synagogues on the planet, was destroyed completely. And it all was done thanks to the Russian, I don't want to use bad words, but like it wasn't really good behavior. All of the bombings that they did, and they kept on doing it till 2 days ago. They kept on bombing. They did not stop bombing.
Kept on bombing till 2 days ago.
Till 2 days ago, there's two towns in central Syria. They're called Restan and Tel Bise. These two towns. I'm hoping to see any kind of content, any kind of images, or maybe I can go there now. But they were bombed for 24 hours nonstop by the Russians, because the rebel troops, before going into a very important city, they were stationed there. So the Russian technique was to just wipe them off the map, which I hope they didn't do that completely. But they destroyed these two towns, hoping that they can kill as many of the rebels as possible.
And there's I understand, a Russian Air Force base and a Russian naval base in Syria.
Yes. And
what's the future of that likely?
they're going to negotiate. uh, it can't go unnoticed that the Russians left some troops in them. So both bases now have Russian troops in them, and they did not escape. So I think they've reached some sort of a deal with the opposition. So that was like 2 days ago. Today, the Russians were talking about that they did actually communicate with the rebels, and the rebels confirmed that they communicated with the Russians, that they will not go into the bases right now. Again, the approach of the rebels so far is not to go into any kind of conflict before they can settle their rule or make things safe, stable in Damascus in particular. So that's their main objective right now. They're not going to go into smaller battles here and there. I know with Russia, it's not a small battle, but
Not a small battle, that's for sure.
definitely. And with Russia, there's a lot of blood and there's a lot of bad history. Again, they intervened 10 years ago and they did not intervene to help anyone. They played a minimum role in building a couple of hospitals, clinics, and the likes. But that doesn't compare to the mass destruction that they have caused and the killing that they inflicted. They didn't just target the rebels. I would have told you it was a fair game, but they went after cities and towns that are historical and ancient. So they did not respect the human life. They did not respect the property. They did not respect the history. They had zero respect for anything in the process of bombing these areas and territories. And they did have the leverage to negotiate with these rebels to move them out of these cities without destroying these cities, because they did that in some places. But in most places, they decided to teach us.
Unbelievable, confluence of events, of different factions, of different militaries, of different religions. It's just amazing what was going on in Syria over the course of the last 50 years, but really last 12 or 20 years. It's an amazing story. We're going to take a break for some messages, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about what we can expect to go, where we expect things to go from here, and what the future is. We've done a great job of covering the past. Let's talk a little bit about both the present, but most importantly, the future. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm chatting with Zein Almoghraby. He's with the Journalists for Human Rights. He's from Syria, from Damascus, an expert on, my gosh, the history lesson that you've given us, sir, is fantastic. So you clearly are an expert in what's going on in Syria. But from an uneducated outsider's standpoint, one of the questions that I think a lot of people have is, no matter how bad, and obviously Assad was very, very bad, gassing his own people, and as you said, 400 to 800,000 people murdered, 500,000 people displaced out of the country, another 5 million people displaced outside of the country, 5 million displaced within the country or more, and 500,000 people imprisoned, maybe more. So very, very bad. But the question is, are you going to actually be better off? And what's the future? Let me just, and you probably know this a million times better than I, but, we think about the Arab Spring. We think about, in Egypt, we were hopeful that we'd have democracy, and we don't. It would appear the Muslim Brotherhood is controlling in a not a dictatorial manner, but almost a dictatorial one-party rule manner. You think about Iraq, and all the money and effort that was spent in Iraq, and are we better off? The world is better off today than under oh my gosh, what was his name? Can't even remember now.
Saddam Hussein.
Yes. And then Iran. Some people thought the Shah was terrible in what the Shah was doing, but the takeover by Ayatollah Khomeini and others, far worse than the theocracy that was put in place. And you go on to talking about what's gone on in Afghanistan after, 25 years of war, and the Taliban is back in control. So, is this rebel group a theocracy that is going to be more stringent and religious and extreme? It certainly doesn't sound very democratic. What's your prognosis? And is the history of what's happened elsewhere a good history or a bad history for what could happen? A good comparable or a bad comparable for what could happen in Syria?
I think the Iranian example is the closest one, knowing that the Libyan, the Iraqi came from an foreign intervention in the sense of an invasion. But in the Iranian case, it was almost completely internal kind of struggle that led to that situation. So I would say, again, I might be an optimistic person by default. So the way I look at it is that we have the advantage of seeing other examples going through this process. Remembering here that it's 54 years of this family, but it's 61 years of this party, of the Ba'ath Party. And before that, there wasn't much of a democracy. Democracy practically lived on for 4 years. And Syria is a new country. It's been around for 100 years now. So there isn't much of an experience in it. And there isn't much, which I understand that put the whole country at some sort of a disadvantage in that context. But also puts you in a situation where you can be like, okay, positively, we didn't do it often and we didn't do it right. Actually, this is practically our first attempt at it. So that's one. I know it's not very valuable, but from a moral perspective, it can have a lot of value by keeping people morale up and excite folks about what they can accomplish. But the most important one is seeing what happened around you. So the downside here that we're looking at, or the thing that is a heartbreaking feeling, is that in all of the Arabic speaking countries after the Arab Spring happened and what happened in Syria, Arab governments will use Syria as an example of why you should not revolt against me, why you should not ask for a reform. So wherever a group of young people would be protesting any kind of process or procedure in a government, any neighboring Arabic government, the governments will tell the public that, do you want to be like Syria? Do you want to be a refugee? Do you want to be displaced and bombed? That's the example that we have. So taking that into consideration, and the fact that this small group of population that was cornered in the northwest of the country, and again, the massive number of armed men who were pro-Assad, they belong to his sect, they belong to the regime very much, decided to let go of their weapons. They've decided to let him collapse. It was their decision that Assad does not exist, or he's not there in the office today. So it was a well-informed decision by the folks who attacked, what they should say, what they should do, by the folks who dropped their weapons, did not fight back, and to deliver the country to them and reach some sort of I don't want to say negotiation, but to have some sort of a deal with it, that everyone comes out of it a winner. So that makes me feel more optimistic about that. Things happened already. You've seen how things operate. You've seen how things can go south and what kind of successful experiences also, right? Like we do have a couple of good experiences from Eastern European countries, knowing that if you look at it, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't have much of a better economic situation. They did have a very similar economic structure, a very similar even social cohesive structure when it comes to free education, free healthcare. It's just very horrible healthcare, and it's very terrible education. So these elements play into it as being like, you see successful experiences, you see not so much in other places, and you hope for the best. Now, knowing the Iranian experience, I think that is again, I'm very positive, I'm very optimistic. Seeing the Iranian experience is actually gives the Syrian now experience much better ammunition to do better, much better ammunition, because it was seen. You saw how it was done, how the regime in Iran used certain slogans and gradually but quickly managed to take over the country with certain kind of a narrative, with certain kind of oppressive power and oppressive tools, or how they pushed away people and became exclusive. All of this, everyone is aware of. And the country is really diverse. So you will have to get the acceptance from the Kurds as a major group that are armed and supported by the US. They're directly supported by the US. You have the Alawites still, who are a strong group regardless. And then the Sunni, the Arab Muslim Sunni, are not one cohesive group. There's differences between the Arab Muslim Sunnis.
So do you think we'll have democracy, or will we have a theocracy?
Definitely, we will not have a theocracy. I can't promise a democracy, though. It might be a process to reach a situation where we will have different political parties running with agendas and being able to vote freely, and people will let go of power. We don't have a practice. Thank God we do have great education, or not great education, but like a great number of educated people. So we do understand democracy at least in theory. We get it in theory, but there's no actual practice yet. So it's going to be a process no matter what.
Is there a role for the United States or Canada, or should we just sit back and see what happens?
Well, in the Canadian, I can tell you about Canada in particular. The US is already involved there, so they can't. It's interesting when they said that we don't want to be involved, that there are American troops, there are American bases in Syria. And again, the Kurdish troops are funded, supported, armed, and even logistically supported by the Americans. So they are already there. They are invested there heavily, strongly since the year 2014. So they can't just say we're not.
We're not involved.
Yes, they are involved. They do control at least 4% of the country, and their allies, the Kurds, control more than 1/3 of the country, including the oil fields. So that's investment there. In the Canadian aspect of it, for it, is that Canada can play a very positive role, non-armed role, not to support any kind of military kind of interventions, but to support, in my case, because I do work with journalists all the time, it would be critical to support journalists right now in Syria, knowing that for 61 years, there was no independent journalism. Journalism was basically a tool for the regime and to glorify the leader. I think we're all familiar with North Korea, so it's not that different. It's very similar. That's journalism. So there's no journalism there. And now it's a critical situation for the country to go through a process of a transitional period that its accountability and justice will be accomplished. And to be able to do so, when you don't have democratic institutions, you will need the medium, the platforms, the space where people can communicate positively and they can communicate in an informed manner. So having media right now in Syria in this period is very critical for the success of this period.
Understood. People need to know what's going on and have accurate information. There's no question. Last question, and this has been incredibly helpful. Thank you. But the last question, to make it a wider Middle East issue for a second, does this have any impact on what's going on in Israel and Gaza and Lebanon?
It has the ultimate impact. I don't think anything that had more impact on the Middle East since even the invasion of Iraq, I would say in 2003, can be the equivalent of this. So this is as big. Iran just lost an investment that has been going on since the year 1980, a very, very rapid investment that started in the year 2005. They invested so much in Syria, and they practically lost everything right now. That's huge for the Middle East. Iran, biggest ally, most important ally is Syria, and now it's over. That will change a lot. Hezbollah in Lebanon, access to weapons, access to support, having their back covered is gone now. There's no more back for Hezbollah. Lebanon does not have borders with anyone but with Israel and Syria. That will put them in a situation where they will have to reconsider things. The Iraqis, they will have to reconsider their relation with the Syrians that is beyond sectarianism, that it has to be based on equality to a certain point at least, and collaboration. Hopefully the Iranians will push them in that direction, so we might have a situation where people can communicate. But now, most importantly, when it comes to the conflict that exists, so Israel in the past 48 hours have bombed Syria after Assad has been, I don't want to say overthrown. He escaped. He ran to Russia. In the past 48 hours, Israel bombed Damascus, bombed military bases that are empty, have nothing in them but equipment. Till now, this moment, the bombing is continuing. I have my brother and my sister there. At the beginning of the collapse of Assad, they heard nothing. Everything is quiet, and then they're hearing bombing. They're asking me, what's the bombing? Is it still on? He told us he's gone. I was like, no, it's not him. It's not the Syrian army. It's someone else now bombing the Syrian army bases, basically. And they advanced, the Israeli army advanced inside of Syria for a very, very limited piece of land. They controlled now 2 villages, and they're heading towards a 3rd village. And that is very problematic by itself. you would assume the opposite is going to happen. Assad is gone. Now everything is possible with the new government. But the approach is we need to ensure that no one will have access to the weapons of the Syrian government, that they can use it randomly. So the weapons practically don't exist anymore right now because the bombing has been going on for 2 days right now. So that is a very bad beginning with the new regime, if we're going to call it that, because it set the mood of being like, you're not friendly to me, and I just came here. So that is going to be, it was a very, very bad call of the Israelis, very bad decision to bomb when people were celebrating live on TV in Damascus, main square, Umayyad Square, celebrating, and then an explosion happens. People freak out, and then it's reported it's an Israeli jet fighter bombing a Syrian government building. That's a very bad beginning.
Then this has been an incredibly educational and interesting conversation. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. I think we're going to have to check in with Zen in another week or two because, oh my gosh, another 12 days could change things up fairly dramatically again. I remind you all on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 a.m. You can stream me online, even from Damascus if you can find a radio or internet at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.